I don't know, maybe Joyce will tell us this, but I have the feeling that we will see more nonfiction from Joyce Carol Oates now than we perhaps did in the past. Could I be right, Joyce, or am I completely wrong?
Possible. I'm working on a memoir. So, and I really love the form. And as you were saying, it crosses over, and I think the act is basically an act of writing and using language.
Can you tell us more about the memoir?
More about the memoir? Well, parts of it have already been published. There was an essay in the New Yorker a couple of years ago, and New York Times Magazine. I usually write because someone has invited me to write. Maybe there's a basic shyness, I'm not sure, but I write fiction sort of easily and spontaneously. But the nonfiction pieces, almost in every case, someone has asked me to think about a certain subject, and then I write about it. I would not have written on, say, an essay on my father, or a memoir about my father. I would have felt shy that, why would anybody care about my father? And because I was invited to, then I started thinking about it, and it evolved into something that I thought I really put a lot of love into it, and it became something that I actually like now, but I would never have written. I've never thought of writing it without being invited to.
How did you feel writing about, much more so about yourself in this memoir?
When you write about yourself, you have to be very careful that you're not obviously offending people, and so you're much more limited. I feel that there are things I can't write about when my parents are still alive. If I've written about them, I can't publish them when my parents are still alive. So, and at the same time, I certainly don't I don't want them not to be alive. So there's a feeling of conflict and almost anxiety there, where I look at something I've written in this memoir, and I read part of it, and I get very nervous and uneasy, so I put it away, and I've been doing this like for 10, 15 years. I have this material. So I would say that it's fraught with an anxiety that may ultimately be disproportionate to its worth, and that we have to make some sort of decision, maybe it's ethical or moral, perhaps only intellectual, but whether something aesthetically can justify the other. I'm not sure in every case that that's true. I think people have made utter fools of themselves, introduced themselves and other people by publishing material that's meretricious and ephemeral and of no real interest. Then they can't ever get it back. It's like making a splash. There has been a well-known magazine, and I won't say the name of the magazine, but you've all read it, that the editor has recently departed from, and she was really known for inviting people, maybe well-known people, writers of some accomplishment, to write pieces that were confessional. And a number of people have done that, and if you look through the back issues of that magazine, of course I mean the New Yorker, you'll see people exposing themselves in ways they would not have thought to have done without the invitation and an offer of a good deal of money. And then it's out there, then people are talking about it. There's a kind of sourness and a kind of dispiritedness when you see this going on. And so, to me, it's a debatable thing. It's ethically debatable. I do feel we have resources of other subjects, of the kind that Barry has written about so beautifully, and many, John McPhee, just to name two distinguished writers of nonfiction. There's so many subjects that one can write about that have a kind of integrity apart from the meretricious, that why should one write about the embarrassing little things, let's say what's happening with Iris Murdoch, the John Bailey piece about the Alzheimer's. I found one of these odd pieces, and maybe people have read that, and people have been talking about it. Some people feel that it was good that he wrote it, John Bailey writing about Iris Murdoch, who has Alzheimer's. Other people felt that he did it because he was invited to, and because he was offered money and exposure. But we know that if people write a piece, or perhaps in the past for Tina Brown, that did not have these disclosures, that was truthful and honest and well-written, even beautifully written, but not shocking, it wouldn't be published. So you have the choice, well, to be published in such a way that you can't get it back and that you have offended people. Paul Theroux is doing a lot of this writing, and he's a good friend of Bill Bilford, who is the fiction editor, one of the editors at the New Yorker. And some of you have worked, I think, for the New Yorker, as people in the room. And Paul Theroux is someone whom I know. I think he's a good writer, but he's been drawn into this, where you're invited to write about something that you would not ordinarily write about, perhaps, but it has to contain something that's a little bit shocking, and you're always pushing to make things seem more melodramatic than maybe they really were in real life. I've talked too much. Anyway, it's a subject that I think a lot about.
I'm curious about how you find, where are the limitations of nonfiction? What makes you think that you can say more or make a stronger impact or reach out and touch and affect your readers in a special way in fiction or perhaps poetry that you can't in nonfiction? Or is it just a question that you're saying that nonfiction is perhaps harder?
I think that writing is basically a sort of mysterious act. Writing is a consequence of thinking and dreaming and meditating and contemplating. And there's a sort of movement of language, I think, almost independent of our rational consciousness. And the language has its own rhythm and cadences. It's rather musical. So to me, language is incantatory. When I write fiction, I never write in my own voice. I'm not sure that I even have a voice. I always write, I don't think I really have my own voice necessarily, but I write from the point of view of characters. And I get to know the characters so well, I'm immersed in them. I usually love my characters. I've written about all kinds of people, including men, who are antithetical to me in every way, you know, superficially at least. And I get into the sort of the pulse. It's like the pulse beat of another's being. And to me, it's like it is incantatory, and virtually all my fiction has that pulse, which is why I love to write. And I had mentioned last night I'm working on a novel, I guess one could call it. In some ways, it's like a prose poem, but that's such a terrible word. If I said prose poem to my publisher, they would just, you know, be dismayed. But it's like the piece that I read from the point of view of Marilyn Monroe when she was Norma Jean, and it was 1945, and she was 23 years old and so forth. And at the same time, it's a posthumous piece. She's already dead. It's already 1998, and she's looking back upon her own life and death and her own career, and she's looking back upon half of a century. And to me, that is a magical experience, at least from my point of view. I don't mean that anyone else would necessarily find it magical, but for me as a writer. Now, when I move into a creative nonfiction, my Muhammad Ali piece is much more my own voice, and I love to write in that mode. I write a good deal of essay reviews for the New York Review of Books, and I have written reviews that are as long as 30 pages. So they're much more than just reviews, but they don't have that incantatory rhythm. They have a more, maybe more conversational, or it's discursive in different ways. I might use footnotes. You know, it's a different kind of discourse, and I think it answers to different kinds of hungers that we have at different times in our lives. If Barry, for instance, is moving toward fiction, he's probably moving toward some hitherto relatively unexplored part of his psyche or his imagination that had been maybe not repressed, but sort of set aside for a while you're doing the other. You're paying homage to the external world, and that was expressing you in an elliptical way as it expressed Henry David Thoreau so beautifully. But now you've done that very well, and you've been acclaimed for it, so now you're sort of moving. I don't want to say you're getting older. That has something to do with it too. You know, you're sort of moving towards something else. I would never have thought a year ago I'd be writing a novel about Norma Jean Baker, who then becomes Marilyn Monroe later, and that I'd spend so much time on her childhood. Like I have 200 pages and she's about 10 years old. If somebody had told me that I'd be doing that this year, I would not have believed it. Truly would not have believed it. I would have said, that's not me.
Here, everyone is concerned about this line between fiction and nonfiction, and when you cross it, and how you know not to cross it, and whether there's an official line or only a personal line. Do you have feelings about the lines that you all draw when you move, when you try to write nonfiction as dramatically as possible?
Would you talk a little bit about your essay about Bill Finnegan's book?
Oh, this is a reference to an essay review that I've published recently in the New York Review of Books. William Finnegan's book, Cold New World, and I've forgotten the exact subtitle. It's something like Youth in America. William Finnegan spent a number of years traveling around America. He basically limited himself to about 4 places and got to know young people. And among them were young people from Antelope Valley, California, where he himself had grown up in the 1950s. So he's making a sort of journey back to his own roots. And basically, I think he, quote, hung out with kids. And I think he got to like them a lot and drove around with them. And the book is probably one of a number of characteristic books of our time. And by showcasing it the way I did in the New York Review of Books, it may have seemed more special than it was. And this is a problem, I guess, with reviewing or even talking about something. We are limited to talking about a few titles this morning, and maybe 100 titles that we could also talk about. But the book is very well written, especially in parts where the author has a true emotional engagement with the subject. Other parts of the book seem more dutiful and rather bloated. I wouldn't say that they were padded. I think he liked what he was doing, but certain parts were fed by the fuel of his emotion. And it was very clear that where he had love for his subject or fascination for his subject, that the writing was really vivid, very, very brilliant. He describes these young people in such wonderful ways, so that when you're reading it, it's like you're present with them. But one thing about nonfiction that Barry perhaps touched upon is that when you have nonfiction, you are being truthful to your subject and your audience. I feel that you have an unwritten contract with your readership. And the contract is everything in my writing will be authentic. And if you want to go to this place I'm writing about, you will find that street there, you will find that building there. I'm not inventing it. I definitely feel that way about my nonfiction. And when you're writing about your family, you have to check with other people to make sure that these memories are actually real. And I spend a good deal of time doing that and having people read it. So there's a contract with the, it's like an ethical contract.
I just want to follow this with one more question, this ethical line. And you're talking about prose that's driven in certain ways. And it occurs to me that memoir is also emotionally driven, like fiction. Can you give us a distinction? Isn't it so that there's a certain fabrication that is almost impossible to avoid when writing a memoir?
Probably using language at all is an artificial act, putting language down and organizing utterances into aesthetically pleasing paragraphs and having sentences that may be long or may be short. If you choose your sentences, like the beat of your sentence, are going to be short sentences going down the page, or going to be long looping sentences. That very act is an act basically that's aesthetic. And one could say it's somewhat fictionalizing. So as soon as you say you're going to write down, for instance, a dream, you've already entered into some enterprise of making it fiction. The dream that you experience, like life itself, is seamless and has no language. So when you start putting the words down, you've already made a choice, and maybe it is originally a sort of ethical choice. So any kind of writing, I think, is an act of fiction and organization and selection, but there's a difference when you're honoring facts. You agree you're not going to violate that basic fabric of reality. When James Joyce writes about Dublin, he's always honoring Dublin, and one could say maybe that's the motive for his writing. It's memorializing that wonderful city that meant so much to him, it created his spirit. He, in creating this enormous novel, Ulysses, each chapter, as you know, it has its own language and its own integrity. Each chapter has its own experiment and its own symbols and so forth. It has its own sentence patterns and rhythms. And there are sections in Ulysses that are surreal and hallucinatory and bizarre. But even in those sections where there's some sort of factual reference, it would be real. People go on walking tours of Dublin, and they make the various stops that Leopold Bloom made, even though much of Bloom's language is fantastical and we're in his head and he's daydreaming. Not to mention Stephen Dedalus with his long sentences and obscure language. But there is a respect for the actual world of Dublin and perhaps of Irish history that is true and authentic, and you can learn from it. Joyce is not inventing that. He's inventing the psychic landscape that's been, sort of imposed upon it in his people. And this distinction between fact and emotional truth, I think, is the basic distinction between nonfiction that we want to believe in. I'm not sure we can believe it even in the New York Times, really, but there's a hunger in us to believe in something. The authentic versus the emotional reality. And then you can't exactly quarrel with someone's emotional reality. Someone is seemingly exaggerating or inventing, but if it seemed that way to the person in remembering an incident from when he or she was 4 years old, then maybe one could argue, well, maybe in a way that was true for that person. So that there is a kind of built-in conflict in memoir. And many of you may be writing memoirs because that seems to be something that you can write out of your own experience. You don't have to be an expert in some other occult field. You can write about your own occult field. So you may be writing memoirs, but if you gave them to family members to read, they would say, but it wasn't that way. That actually didn't happen to you. That happened to me. Or that wasn't your aunt. That was somebody else's, the neighbor, And you'll find that. So you'll be very hesitant to show other people these memoirs because they're the truth from your point of view. But when you're writing fiction, if you're writing autobiographical fiction, you wouldn't run into that. First of all, the act of writing fiction is an act of selection. You can't honor the multiplicity of facts in the real world in fiction. You can't even begin to try. A biography sets down a certain chronology of a life. It may not be in that order, but it has to be there in some order, even if it's broken up. But these are factual things, and a number of things have happened to a person that may be a million bits of information. You can't do that in a novel. A novel would just fall into bits. It wouldn't work at all. In this novel, that's sort of experimental that I'm working on about Norma Jean Baker, Norma Jean, who becomes Marilyn Monroe later on, is sort of this concoction that is Marilyn Monroe. Norma Jean was in maybe 12 foster homes and 1 orphanage. I would not write in a novel about 12 foster homes. Absolutely not. I write about 1. And the orphanage and the foster home, just these 2 things. You can't do it in the way that a biography should do it because it would just not be interesting. One repetition after another. Like a diary of the meals that you've had for a month. Who's going to read it? Norma Jean was very likely sexually abused and molested many times in these various homes not because she was already Marilyn Monroe, but because this is what happens to children unprotected in our society, both boys and girls. It would have been amazing if she had not been molested sexually when she was perhaps 7 years old. That would have been more surprising than the fact that she was. But in my novel, I'm not going to have her sexually abused like every 6 weeks or so. There may be one incident sort of that she kind of remembers vaguely. One, that's got to do for maybe 30, and so forth. These are the choices you make as a novelist. Things happen in Norma Jean's life that were violent. I'm not even going to put in a novel. I'm known to write about violence, but actually I drop out a lot. I don't put as much in as would have been realistic for that time and place in the writing that I've done. I might select one act of violence, and in real life, if I'm drawing upon memory, there were 30 acts of violence. These are the choices that you make when you're writing fiction. But if you're writing nonfiction, I don't think you can exactly do that. I don't think you can say, well, she was in one foster home and so forth. You have to make some attempt to be true to that external reality that's quite independent of your own choices.
Can I just follow that up with one other question? Just here's a sentence that I hope you would amplify on that you wrote in the New York Times not too long ago. We are the species that clamors to be lied to.
That's true. We are the species that yearns to be lied to. We rush out and we vote for politicians. And some of us, we all remember going to vote for a presidential election and having some sense of, this time the vote really counts. This is really, really a good candidate this time. And some of us had that feeling a lot of times, haven't we? People want to believe.
Joyce, did you want to add?
Well, I had not known about the nature photography moving into this other sphere that's like the surreal, and I find that very upsetting. I remember when I was quite young, and I subscribed to Scientific American, and I would have been completely demoralized to learn that what I was reading, was in some way not absolutely true. I always felt that was true. I mean, I would be reading comic books and doing, reading other things I knew were magical thinking. Well, we call them a primitive thinking or magical thinking in contrast to this world of a responsible adult thinking. But I didn't know about this, about the nature photography. It is very disturbing.
It's
shocking.
So I'm kind of curious, what sort of preparatory work do you both go through before you begin to sit down and touch word to page?
Well, since my temperament is probably a little more toward the fictional or the poetic, and I think in terms of distillations and impressions and structures, before I think in terms of content, I probably would do disproportionately or proportionally much less research or preparation than people who do real creative nonfiction, more or less, for a living, because I come to it from another perspective. I think either way is perfectly legitimate. I will have an idea, an impression, a kind of excitement about a subject, and I will get an idea of its structure and maybe even the ending and what I want to do. And I have a visual sense of how it will look in a sort of architectural way. I can do all of that far in advance of the content. I can assume certain things, if I'm writing about Norma Jean Baker or Muhammad Ali or boxing, I can assume certain things in the subject that are rhythms that maybe are universal or transpersonal. And so I maybe have an advantage over other writers. I know I became quite friendly with other boxing writers and sports writers. And they said they really envied me. I could start writing a book before I knew much of the data that would go into it. They begin the other way. They begin with the facts, amassing the facts, and sometimes they end with that. I became friendly with a sports writer for the New York Times. And he never really was able to get beyond that because as a journalist, he wasn't really allowed or encouraged to do that kind of writing. Does this make any sense what I'm talking about? So that I have a structure for a novel or a book or even my book on boxing. I had certain ideas before I went in. And then I find the research very wonderful. It's like a vacation. It's just so exciting to see films, to talk to people. Surely one of the great enjoyments of life would be to be an investigative reporter and go around and see people and talk to people, interview them, take their pictures, get to know them. That must be so wonderful. I mean, I've never done much of that. I got to know a couple of boxers, and I got to know some of their managers, and I visited, for instance, Mike Tyson's training camp at Catskill, and I got to know Tyson a little bit. This is the other Tyson before he seems to have disintegrated, the Tyson of the late, mid-1980s. So that was wonderful, but I don't do much of that. I'm not that kind of writer. Someone like Barry, not that there's anybody else like Barry, but Barry, does a lot of traveling and basically had a really good time. I mean, it sort of radiates in the prose that this is somebody who's having a good time. And your Coy Vales are back in their studies, sort of working at their novels, and they're not out there in the bright sunshine in the Arctic seeing these things and having these adventures. It's easier in one way, and it's not easier in another way, if you understand what I'm saying. But the research part of it, I think, is absolutely wonderful. And I think that people who do this kind of writing do it because they basically like to snoop around in reality and see what's there.
Joyce, you made the distinction yesterday that you did all of your own research. I'm kind of curious, do other writers that you know not do their own research?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. They have assistants, even sometimes graduate assistants, even at the university. These are not people who are multimillionaires. And then the ones who made a good deal of money, they have teams of assistants. I was looking at the biography of Marilyn Monroe. Biography is not really the right word, by Norman Mailer. It's so clear that people were providing Norman with information because it's not assimilated, and he puts it into what he thinks is a biography. And he doesn't know that some other book has really rejected some of these findings, as these are earlier, and they're kind of all put together. And it's, it's kind of embarrassing, like the seams are showing. Obviously, this person who wrote that book didn't really do any research himself. It's just kind of jammed together. Can I just add something? I think sometimes it's rather innocent, and that we ought not to be too judgmental. People are using research and assistants and so forth. I was thinking here, sort of smiling myself. I'm quite good friends with a very famous writer. He's an elegant stylist, and I like him a lot. He's very prolific and famous writer, basically. You all know his name. Anyway, he has his elegant prose and just vivid, careful metaphors, and he describes things very, very sensuously and specifically. And I happen to know that he doesn't know anything about nature. His wife's a gardener, and she has nice things in the garden, and he might sort of look at the garden and walk through. And I read this novel of his. I won't say the title of the novel, because then you know who this is. And he has all these wildflowers, like he's describing them in the names, and maybe even the Latin names, and all this very wonderful, it seemed believable detail, the sort of thing that a literary critic or a reviewer might isolate and say, this is really good writing. So when I saw him the next time, I said, where did you get that? He blushed a little, and he didn't have to tell me, he got it out of a book. He's got like the nature book here open on his desk, and it's kind of innocent and harmless, I think.
Just kind of curious about your feeling about what is happening to the publishing world generally, the smaller or middle-sized publishing companies being swallowed by the larger companies, and how that is affecting the world of writers in two ways. Your world as far as getting responses and help from editors generally, and secondarily, do you think in the publishing climate now you could have progressed through it today the way you were fortunate enough and obviously talented enough to progress through it 20 years ago?
I don't really feel qualified enough to speak in a very general way about the publishing world. I just have my own perspective, and I tend not to know what's going on. I'm the sort of person who doesn't know how much money is being made, or I basically don't know how much money I make. I really out of that loop. I'm so involved with the imagination or with language, I really don't feel that I'm up to answering that question, and there may be people in the audience who know more than I do.
Your passion for writing, have you ever lost it?
No. It's like a passion for life. No.
What's the most difficult part of the writing process for you both?
I always feel very melancholy and bereft after I finish the work that is really finished and it's been sent off, I guess, for the final time. That's the hardest part. It's like giving up some part of your life, actually. It is, in fact, the part of your life that's gone. The emotional experiences that you had, even the ones that seem very negative and disruptive, are gone forever. And sometimes people don't want to give up their manuscripts. I have friends who hang on to novels for years, and they just don't want to give it up because they know that when it's gone, there will be the morning after it's gone where you approach your desk or whatever you approach and it's not there anymore and you have to begin all over again. So I think that's my hardest part.
How much of writing is the talent that you're born with, and how much of it is something that can be developed?
Well, that's impossible to answer. I would say, I don't mean to be giving all these short answers, but it depends on who the writer is. I mean, we know that James Joyce had great genius for language, but he took 10 years to write Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man. So think about that. You know, it's a combination of both.
How do you reconcile a love of solitude with your need to promote your books?
Well, we don't reconcile it.